Thank you for joining us today for session one of the Pulitzer Center series, The Coastal Southeast, Rising and Hazardous Waters. As we wait for more people to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening from. I am Kayla Edwards from the Pulitzer Center. For those of you who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization supporting more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. We have developed strong K-12 education through university programming that engages students and teachers on underreported issues across the globe. We also organize public events such as this one. Our conversation today focuses on a decade of change in how scientists, journalists, museum curators, and coastal residents discuss climate science along the North Carolina coast. This session's featured reporting, published by Coastal Review Online, is part of the Pulitzer Center's Connected Coastlines initiative, which seeks to connect and enable local newsrooms and US coastal states to report on climate science issues. Please be sure to check out all of the Connected Coastlines reporting on our website, including a new 7-part series called Beyond the Beach from the Raleigh News and Observer and the state newspapers, which just published this morning. A few logistic matters before we get started. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions as part of today's conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. Please begin adding your questions as soon as something comes to mind at any time during the conversation. There's also a chat icon on your screen. We'd appreciate it if you'd use the chat box only for specific technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, please let us know. We want to let you know we are recording this session to post online at a later date. And one final note, please remember to stay online once the conversation ends to learn about session 2 of this series on Thursday, and then to participate in a brief survey. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Mark Hibbs is the editor of Coastal Review Online. Mark joined Coastal Review Online in 2015 after more than 20 years with the Carteret County News-Times. Kirk Ross, a longtime North Carolina journalist based in Chapel Hill, is the lead legislative reporter for Coastal Review Online. Dr. Kathie Dello is the state climatologist of North Carolina and the director of the North Carolina State Climate Office. Karen Willis Amspacher, a native of Harkers Island, is the founding director of the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center. And finally, Yolanda is director of the film Mi Casita and a Working Narratives Resiliency Media Fellow. Yolanda is also a bilingual educator and storyteller. Thank you each for joining us. We'll begin with questions for each of the panelists. Mark, I'd like to start our discussion with you. Can you please give us an overview of your reporting project, Changing Minds on Climate Science?
Sure, Kayla. Thank you. A decade ago, the science of climate change threatened to put a crimp in the very lucrative coastal real estate market in North Carolina. Never mind that for decades before that, houses originally built 3 or 4 streets back from the water kept winding up being oceanfront homes. But for a long time, a lot of that was the result of natural coastal erosion, the movement of sand. But the erosion started getting worse. And in 2010, when a panel of coastal scientists released a report that found that sea levels could rise by up to 39 inches by the end of the century, well, that meant sea level rise wasn't just a problem for the immediate coast. We're all picking up the tab for the effects of sea level rise. North Carolina's 20 coastal counties are each surrounded by water, with people living and working right there on the rivers, creeks, sounds, bays, estuaries, as well as the ocean. And each year, the rising water has made life harder and more expensive. Brunswick, Dare, and Hyde counties each had 10 hurricane-based FEMA disasters between 2010 and 2019. Add Dorian to the list, and nearly nearly a dozen other North Carolina counties for this year. Losses from Florence 2 years ago totaled $22 billion in North Carolina, and 15 people died here. Maintaining Highway 12 on North Carolina's Outer Banks has cost the state about $75 million in the last 10 years. But back to the sea level rise report. It was meant to guide planners and policymakers, but it alarmed a lot of people who sold real estate and a lot of other folks too. And the report arrived just when the Republicans had taken over the North Carolina legislature for the first time in about a century. As Dr. Christine Voss of UNC said in one of our stories, when folks started worrying that their livelihoods could be threatened by acknowledging the effects of climate change, a disinformation campaign was launched. Not only was sea level rise dismissed, but there was also a concerted effort to block development of cleaner, renewable energy. Wind energy projects were blocked when opponents raised what they said were health concerns. They said wind turbines were ugly and would threaten our tourism industry here on the coast. The legislature tried for years to ban wind energy development in North Carolina. Solar energy has been dismissed for years, yet it's now considered the cheapest form of energy available. And while all this was going on, change was happening. Sunny day flooding was becoming a more frequent problem. Minimal storms were becoming major flood events. Salt water kept reaching farther landward beneath the ground, and it was fouling people's drinking water wells and ruining croplands and turning lush green coastal areas into ghost forests. Then came Matthew, Florence, and Dorian. We knew from our reporting that efforts to make coastal communities more resilient were happening. We also knew that a state resiliency plan was in the works. And we knew that the governor was pushing for renewable energy and opposing offshore oil. We weren't sure, but people's attitudes toward climate science seemed to be changing too. And that's what we sought to gauge with our series for Connected Coastlines. How have the people in the areas that we cover changed in their thinking? How do people feel about climate science now? And how have those attitudes changed since the 2010 sea level rise report? Of course, we wanted to bring scientists into the conversation, but it was maybe more important to us to bring in the voices of regular folks whose lives have been affected. Old timers, young adults, high school kids. We really wanted their stories to be the centerpiece of our series, and that was only possible with the help of our partners like Karen and Yolanda and the Brunswick County Early College High School. And of course, we have to thank the Pulitzer Center for supporting this project.
Mark. Kirk, I'd like to ask you about the legislative angle of the story. Can you walk us through the last decade of climate science legislation in North Carolina?
Well, the main piece of legislation, the one that Mark referred to, came about as part of that backlash against the climate science report. Prior to that, the state had been in a direction of encouraging more solar. They had developed some programs to kind of diversify the power grid and add more solar and require energy producers to have renewables in their portfolio. Around the same time as the sea level rise backlash happened, they were also rolling back some of these reforms and regulations, and generally going against rulemaking and regulations in general. So there was an anti-regulatory push that was kind of going on at the same time. So you had this bill that was introduced after the report came out that said only a certain group will name the official sea level rise of North Carolina. No one is allowed to use anything but that sea level rise, the official sea level rise rate, in any kind of ordinance, any kind of rule, and we're talking local governments. It would have influenced somewhat planning. up and down the coast, but also inland as well. You wouldn't have been able to write an ordinance using anything but the historic rate of sea level rise. And it was the original version of the bill got such a reaction that they pulled it. They came back a couple weeks later and passed another bill that was significantly watered down, but it still had the same philosophy of the state stepping in and trying to manage the science. I guess it'd be a nice way of putting it. And of course, there was international ridicule came about, and the story got out and got quite a bit of play. At the same time, I don't think it changed a lot of behavior on the part of planners on the coast. I think people were still at the local level. We're still going at it. We're still recognizing that there was change, and but there was a chill in the state legislature, and I think it just, more than anything else, just froze any discussion of it, of climate change throughout, well, for about 4 or 5 years, really. There was a push for fracking. There was a push for offshore drilling. And when the legislature developed supermajorities, or won supermajorities, there was quite an effort to try to get North Carolina as an energy state, an energy producer. And I think the current governor, Roy Cooper, ran against that, mentioning climate change, talking about it openly. And there was a lot of backlash in the state against the idea of opening up the inner part of the state, the central part of the state, to fracking and offshore drilling. And I think Cooper picked up a lot of votes, especially on the coast, because of that. And since then, there's been really a standoff between the governor and the legislature, and there hasn't been there's been a coherent state policy, but they're in silos. The legislature is in one, kind of frozen in one direction, and has been willing to fund things like resiliency and storm recovery and ideas like that. But when it comes to climate change itself and mitigation, they've still been, it's still been frozen out. The governor, on the other hand, has a complete top to bottom strategy for how to approach it. But he can only do so much. The executive branch in the state can only do so much. North Carolina is one of these states where the legislature is very powerful. And as a result, a lot of the big things that could happen, a lot of the big funding is going to take a while. And it's going to take change at the legislative level for things to really get going.
Thank you, Kirk. And yeah, I do want to come back later and kind of get more of that difference between some of the resiliency language you're talking about versus mitigation. But before we touch on that subject, Dr. Dello, I do want to turn to you and thinking about, so in 2020, the North Carolina Climate Science Report was kind of drafted by this group of scientists in the state. Can you tell me, what core climate science developments that you would want readers of either the plain language report or viewers of one of your lectures to really walk away with? Like, what has changed in 10 years in terms of the climate science?
Yeah, and hello everybody, and you'll have to excuse me. I have an allergy-related cough, and I'm going to try to make it through my, I think, 4 minutes, but I may have to cut out a little bit earlier. So yeah, the report came out in March of 2020, March 11th to be exact, and many of you probably remember that day is truly the day we went into lockdown. And I think as a result, it didn't get as much attention. Certainly the country was focused on a very big issue at the time. But the report is the first of its kind for North Carolina. It's a truly comprehensive climate assessment drawn up by independent scientists. So I was on the author team. I was also on the advisory panel. And the author team was drawn from folks at NC State and UNC. And we're really lucky in North Carolina to have this rich intellectual diversity on climate science. So this report is a good foundational resource for journalists, for the public, for decision makers about what we've seen in the past in North Carolina and what we're expecting in the future. And it's funny, we're talking about the past 10 years. I've worked professionally as a climate scientist in 2 states, Oregon and North Carolina. And 10 years ago, it was completely different, even in Oregon. And yes, we heard about what was going on in North Carolina. And when I took this job, many people brought it up thinking it was still an issue. But climate change is here and it's now. So Mark detailed the disasters that we've seen in coastal North Carolina. And it's now indisputable that climate change is affecting us in our backyard. And there are serious consequences for the folks who live in North Carolina. That's all of us, and who love North Carolina and have a rich history and ties to the state. So we're looking at a hotter, more humid and wetter North Carolina. And if you've been in the state in the past 6 months, you've certainly seen wetter. I was just talking about an event that hit downtown Raleigh at the end of August. We got about 6 inches of rain in about 12 hours. That's extreme precipitation. I was telling the folks that I took this background picture when I was trying to camp, and I was dodging 4 inches of rain then. We're getting these really big precipitation events, and it's not always coming from hurricanes anymore or tropical events. So we have these cutoff lows, which basically are these low pressure systems that sit and spin over North Carolina. We also have convective events, our summertime thunderstorms. But what we're doing is really supercharging the atmosphere with more moisture. So a more humid North Carolina is definitely something that we are expecting in the future. And when you couple that with hot temperatures, both daytime and nighttime, you have a serious public health risk on your hands. So this really does harm people. It's harming people. And when we think about outdoor workers and folks who don't have access to cooling or can't afford to cool their houses just because of the cost of energy, you're looking at some really serious issues with climate change. So what I want people to know is that we are in a different North Carolina, but this is just a stop. This is the new normal, but there will be another new normal. And we're looking at temperature projections of 4 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And that's totally dependent on global behavior. If we draw up some policies and adhere to them, we might see the 4 to 5 degree increase by the end of the century. But if we keep doing what we're doing with fossil fuels as a planet, not just me and you in our homes, we could see 10 degrees Fahrenheit of average warming by the end of the century. That is a completely different state than we've seen in our historical past.
Thank you, Dr. Dello. And kind of drawing on what you're saying in terms of the real world impacts, the way that this is going to impact individual families, I'd like to turn to our next panelist, Yolanda House. And before I ask Yolanda a question, I'd like to play a brief clip from her film, Mi Casita.
All of my mom's hard work, Florence took. I already knew before we came back that the tree had fallen down our trailer. My bed was located in the corner near the window. Yeah. So this is where the tree hit the whole wall where the window was. And my stepdad came home and he was like, no, I'm gonna get fixing on the roof because it was still raining. If he would have probably waited 2 more days, this would have probably been flooded with water. By the time FEMA came, we already had some of the roof fixed up, so they didn't see the full damage of the house. We decided to stay after the hurricane because that's where home was and there was barely any rentals in Wilmington. But that was 7 months we had to live so uncomfortable. The power goes in and out the whole trailer. Everybody's squished together. Sometimes come home from work stressed and you just want some alone time, and you can't have that because only one room of the trailer is livable.
And you can find the entirety of Mi Casita, Yolanda's film, on the Pulitzer Center website and also through the organization Working Narratives. Yolanda, I'd like to turn to you. Can you, tell us about your film Mi Casita and how and why you chose to communicate the story of climate change, the story of Hurricane Florence's effect through this family?
Yes. So thank you very much for having me. I witnessed the effects of so many families and friends who lost their homes due to flooding, and a lot of the low-income community families were forced to be evicted due to damage from mold in their rentals. So when I witnessed the loss, I immediately felt compelled to help as a community member. And yes, I helped with, supply distribution, and yet I still felt helpless. And especially when the news coverage left Wilmington, North Carolina, the national news coverage left, I said to myself, who's going to cover the stories that still need to be told and need resources to create change? So when I heard about Working Narratives offering a fellowship through Shorelines Media, Resiliency, I immediately signed up, because I figured, if they train me as a citizen journalist, then I could tell the story. And the reason I chose this family was I really, as a amateur filmmaker, I really wanted to illustrate the vulnerability of the infrastructure of this trailer home park community and the lives that live there. And at the same time, as a community activist, I really wanted to highlight the voice of this 19-year-old Latina who found the resilience within her own family and her community to rebuild after the storm. And as you notice, she decided not to show her face, but I wanted to give her the dignity to highlight her voice, that she became the expert of her daily struggle.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you for sharing your film with us. In a similar vein, Karen, my next question is for you. As we're thinking about, how we choose to remember these events, or how we choose to also, maintain the culture and remember the culture of the kind of coast of North Carolina, as a native of Harkers Island, and as, in your work with the Corsound Waterfowl Museum, how have you documented or seeking to show the effects of climate science and also your culture on Harkers Island?
I came from a community, Harkers Island, that was settled by refugees from the storm of 1899. My grandmother was born on Shackelford Banks, which is just a few miles across the Sound. And after the storms of 1896 and 1899, they took their houses apart, floated them on dories, and moved to Harkers Island. So I grew up in a world of migration stories of how the storms drove them in. So when, over the past 20, 30 years, I've been at the museum almost 30 years. It's been from its beginning. The whole concept of sea level rise began to leak into the communities. The struggle that Kirk and Mark and all the journalists talk about what's going on in Raleigh. I watched it closely, very, very closely, because I try to be a voice for and by the community. So I was following it day by day, but as a regular person in my community, that was all distant from what was going on. But now, after Isabel in 2003 and Irene in 2011 and Florence in 2018, we're living with what the politicians and policymakers were or not making, as is the case 10, 15 years ago. So at the museum, we're kind of caught in the middle. We're celebrating and honoring a culture of resilience and determination and stubbornness and adaptability. And I said in a meeting one time, I just hate this word resilience. It's such a term. I mean, what choice do you have but to be resilient? You pick it up and put it back together. So how do you talk to a community that is determined to live in this place on the edge, has for generations? How do you get through to them? And Florence came, and in 2 days, the conversation changed, because the cumulative impacts, not only of those storms, but the high tide that we live with all the time, the trees that are dying are at the edges of the marsh, the water table. I can walk in my backyard right now and it's soggy bottom. So all of those things became very real in Florence, and the conversation changed. At the time Florence hit the museum where I worked, they ended up with $3.4 million in damage from mold. We had a leaky roof, and that mold and the temperatures and humidity completely destroyed the building. We had 2 exhibitions. One was a historic look at how storms had shaped our culture, and the other traveling exhibit was called Rising in Sea. And I weighed and measured every word that was in those text panels in 2018 before Florence to make sure I didn't set off alarm bells in my community and the political landscape that we live here. And when we put the museum back together, we just moved back in June. We were out 18 months. We have combined those exhibitions into one new exhibit called Living on the Edge. And the goal is to look at the historic forces, but also look at the change that's going on right now. And subtly, but very persistently encourage our people to ask the questions. How can we stay in these communities that are literally at or below sea level, with these continual rising tides, with these storms that we know are coming again? How do we sustain our communities? Because we're not leaving. We are not leaving. So how do we stay?
Thank you, Karen. And maybe a quick follow-up for you. How did you decide to, combine those 2 exhibits? One that's showing this kind of overview of the photos, the landscape of North Carolina and how it's changing, but then also this history of storms that does have this more explicit culture tie. When did you decide to combine the 2?
Because with Florence, it was all those factors. Florence changed everything, and I got much braver after Florence. I got to the point that, okay, if I get beat up, I get beat up, but we've got to put this story together, and people have to realize that it's not a separate issue. It is all one of the same, and we're here in this, living it every day. And we have had very, very important feedback. People who they spend so much time. I mean, it's a very interesting multimedia exhibition. We did it all in-house, so it's very raw. It's all about the people telling their voices, telling their stories through their own voices. And I'm very eager for many reasons, but also for the COVID to get out of the way, because the goal was to have more community meetings as a part, as an extension of these 2 exhibits coming together. So it's an important conversation that has to be taught. It has to be held, and it has to come from the bottom up. I mean, the policies that Kirk and Mark and everybody talks about, that's one thing, but on the ground is something else. And it takes a long time for programs and policies in Raleigh to make its way to the end of the road.
Thank you, Karen. And so I'm going to start pulling in some audience questions. There are a lot of good ones. And the first one, as several people have asked, are these similar issues happening in South Carolina? So Dr. Dello, I don't know if you have, initial thoughts or response, but I will say, and this is not a plug, but on Thursday, we will have another session 2 of this series that does have a more explicit focus on South Carolina and Georgia. And yes, sea level rise and also extreme flooding, which is also seen very much in Charleston, will be discussed there. But Dr. Dello, from your perspective as climatologist, maybe in conversation with others, is this a similar situation and conversation happening in South Carolina?
So the ocean and the atmosphere doesn't stop at the border, no matter how much we might want it to at some time. So they are seeing similar impacts. I think the conversation's a little bit different, and I can't necessarily speak to the nuances of what's going on in South Carolina, but I think the conversation is very developed here in North Carolina, and all the panelists spoke to this, Florence and significant policy and kind of understanding that climate change is here in our backyard.
Thank you, Dr. Dello. Kirk, there's a question from the audience that going back to this kind of discussion, the word resilience, and I know Karen touched on this, but can you, from the legislative angle, tell us a little bit about resilience efforts versus maybe mitigation, or so what those terms tend to mean when we're looking at policy?
I think I'll start with, generally mitigation means producing less greenhouse gases, means actually producing less. And Kathie, jump in if I get this wrong. And resiliency and adaptation are kind of used hand in hand. Are weathering what is coming and what's happening now, and what is sort of already baked in terms of climate change. So resiliency has been, whereas mitigation, which might be something like those renewable energy portfolios requiring producers to produce with using fewer fossil fuels, things like that, that's what's been hard to get through the legislature. But resiliency has become a part of the storm response and the long-term storm response. I think there was an acknowledgement after, Florence was biblical. Matthew was epic. It was about as bad, maybe not quite as bad as Floyd in 1999. Very similar storms where they just dump a lot of water in an area. But Florence, really, people described it in biblical terms, and there were the images from it of fish strewn up I-95 or I-40. It was striking, and it was $17 billion compared to Matthew, which was 4.8 billion. Or actually, the initial was 17 billion. I think the total for the whole storm was 22, 23. And so the scale of things just swamped everybody. And so the response, we realized that we could not, as a state, could not just keep rebuilding in the same places. That second storm convinced everybody that there were places where you just could not rebuild, or had to do something different in terms of to get people out of harm's way. They were rescuing people in the same areas twice in less than 2 years. And so, there has been a lot of thought and a lot of agreement, oddly, between the legislature and the governor, while they're fighting over everything else, to at least put some thought into this and to move forward and to put some kind of funding into it. But we're still, in a way, in a holding pattern. The one solid thing that really came out of Florence was the Office of Resiliency and Recovering Resiliency to manage this giant flood of federal money that's coming into this state. And there wasn't anybody in the state who really knew how to put together the grants and fulfill all the HUD requirements, just the expertise that was required after Matthew was kind of swamped folks. And we really took a while getting ramped up. I think it's a pretty good operation right now, and they're funneling money, but ultimately they realize that the decisions have to happen on a local level, that it can't be top down. And so that's what Karen's getting at. Her folks want to stay. They want to find a way to stay. Places in New Bern and other places, they want to keep a community center that has been the lifeblood of their community. That's been the central focus of their community. Other towns don't want to lose their town halls. So there has to be some kind of way to prioritize, way to get this kind of buy-in. And I think, not to ramble on too much, but what the state's trying to do is they're trying to roll up as many community-based ideas as they can. They have a good bit of federal funding. I think the state can put more funding in as well, but they need a strategy that works. And I think they're looking for a lot of local projects to improve, to raise up, and we'll go with that first. It's kind of an all carrot approach right now, and we won't get to the stick until a little bit later, but we will eventually have to. I don't know if that made much sense.
It made perfect sense, Kirk. Thank you. And yeah, there are several tensions just in all of the conversations. Another question that I'm seeing from audience member Rick is about data and information that is available to citizens, to community leaders, to politicians about living at the coast, or just the climate science conversation in general. So can anyone on the panel kind of think of where the best places for this kind of group of stakeholders to get data and information? And Rick was also wondering, does that information exist? Is it available? And that we just aren't, it's not in the media enough. Dr. Dello, I don't know if you want to start maybe off with some of the climate science report work, but also the other panelists, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so truly my job is to work with climate data and information. My office is the State Climate Office of North Carolina, and we are the repository for climate knowledge for the state. And most states have a similar office, though ours is quite a bit larger than many of the surrounding states, and a testament to just how tied to understanding North Carolina's climate this state is. There are reports, so there's the North Carolina Climate Science Report, there's the National Climate Assessment, and the 5th one is staffing up right now, so that has to come out. It's an act of Congress, and there's a section on the Southeast. But I do want to underscore, I think the work I do and that my colleagues do is very important, but facts don't necessarily change people's mind, and we're seeing a lot of that play out now. So I think the stories are also really powerful. So the stories you're hearing from the other folks on the panel, coupled with those facts peppered in, I think is the winning combination.
Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit about just data and information, how you kind of gathered in Coastal Review Online, just in general, how you all kind of gather information and share that with the public also.
Well, I think we're fortunate here on the coast in that we have a lot of science that happens right here, a lot of research that takes place right here on the coast. We have the University of North Carolina Institute for Marine Sciences. We have the NC State Center for Marine Science and Technology. We have Duke University's Marine Lab. We have a NOAA lab here. We have the Coastal Studies Institute up in Wanchese. So we have a lot of science and a lot of scientists who live here in the community. And in talking with them, they'll tell you that scientists are not always the best at communicating their science and getting it out to the public. But I may have rambled off and lost my train of thoughts. But there are a lot of resources here, and we did reach out to these scientists in our communities to put these stories together, and we did get a lot of cooperation from these folks.
Thank you, Mark. So there are several questions about practical solutions and also what to do with the fact that as sea levels rise, communities on the coast are going to remain in harm's way, is what it's called. So I know, Dr. Dello, you might have a perspective in terms of what you tell people, who are worried about climate change, what actionable steps they can take, but also want to pose this to Kirk or Mark in terms of the reporting and legislative angle. What types of conversations or ideas have been presented? But I will open it up to any panelist.
I guess I'll just briefly start out. The two things I tell people: vote and talk to your friends and neighbors about climate change. A lot of people aren't thinking about it all the time. They have other things going on. Certainly, you can see the impacts, the sunny day flooding, the sea level rise, but I'm not always the trusted source. I'm new to the state and I recognize that, but you might trust your neighbor or your friend or even somebody from your community in the grocery store. And if you do talk to them about climate change, it really does resonate. And that's something concrete you can do.
Thank you, Dr. Dello. Kirk, I don't know if you have any thoughts from a legislative angle, what people are talking about, what ideas are being presented with the real tension here that people along the coast are at risk.
Well, I think there are some pretty good efforts underway. They're in the early stages. The legislature actually kicked some money into a program at the end of the last session, and that the governor's behind, to accelerate this idea of using lands throughout the floodplain in eastern North Carolina, using natural lands and also working lands, farmland and places throughout the floodplains, to kind of open them up and take some pressure off of communities downstream. I think there's also been a lot of thought put into how to do buyouts and how to do them right. You can't just throw money at the program. You have to have places for people to go. They are NCORE, who I mentioned earlier, they are building housing units and moving families out of the floodplains. And I think they have a good grasp of the enormity of the problem, because Eastern North Carolina has long had challenges. And, there's a lot of folks who live in the low-lying areas don't have the means to move. And so I think there's kind of, it was even referred to as sort of a New Deal approach, where you try to do something that looks at addressing the most vulnerable populations first, and make them a priority, and those kind of mitigation efforts, assisting the people who don't have a means to move out, working on a decent buyout. Some of those community-driven efforts are probably going to be where the successes are, and they're in the very early stages. But you think about the natural lands aspect, probably the biggest resource in Eastern North Carolina is just how big it is, and how there's lots of vast empty land or semi-empty land in Eastern North Carolina that can be used for what they're talking about. And so I do see some good policy work being done, but the commitment really is got to come from both the federal and the state government to make these kind of large-scale programs work. You can't just pick a community up and move a community. It's not that simple.
And I'd like to address that. The socioeconomic aspect of this is it can't be overstated, and it's probably been about 10 years ago now. There was an effort to reform the National Flood Insurance Program, and it kind of had gotten to the point where it was being discussed at the state and local levels. And what was becoming clear, covering it at the local level here, and it later became more of a national story, is that the proposals that they put forth, like addressing these repetitive loss cases, where homes are repeatedly flooded, and getting people out of those homes. They're talking about elderly folks who've lived there for decades. They're talking about lower income folks who, as others have said, can't afford to move. And it was these flood insurance reforms that they were talking about disproportionately affected these people who really, their choices were limited. And that's going to be the biggest challenge, I think, moving ahead.
Yolanda, yes, in your film, you address this issue very directly. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts also.
Yes. So we talk about gathering data. At the same time, we have to think about gathering stories, real life stories, especially in those marginalized communities that already are facing some kind of hardship. And then you add a natural disaster to their situation. It's very chaotic to their families and their community. And ultimately it affects our state. So my key point is, what are the problems within that story? And take the time to listen. I learned in my fellowship that I was just listening to their story. I wasn't putting any input. I wasn't even helping. I was more using my ears to listen. And when I listened, I learned that my subject had figured out what her home needed and what was her next plan when the next disaster hit.
Thank you, Yolanda. And then, so a next question that I am seeing from audience member Carl is about this language that's really at the core of the reporting, Mark. And I know Karen touched on this in the reporting, actually, is whether people are talking about in North Carolina climate change as a term, or they're using words like sea level rise or coastal erosion. How people are talking and using terms kind of interchangeably, what that means today, and what you see is happening going forward.
Yeah, I think the terminology is what maybe drives the wedge sometimes. The lingo, people see the effects and they have their own explanation for what's going on. And maybe they're, correct, or maybe they're partially correct, or maybe they're completely misunderstanding it, but they see these effects, they see what's going on, flooded farmlands, things like that. I think the challenge is finding some way to bridge that gap, and that's really what we attempted to do by bringing in some of the voices that we brought into our series, was just to put it into, let people, as Yolanda said, let people tell their own stories.
And I would like to add, as part of the Rising exhibition we had 3 weeks right before Florence hit, we brought in some folks from the Chesapeake Bay, Smith Island, just north of Tangier Island and Deal Island, to be part of a community conversation at the museum. And at the end of the day, it became a situation of semantics. I mean, Mike is real eager to talk about tide. They'll even talk about sea level rise in certain occasions, but they'll talk about the high tide. In fact, I had somebody come this weekend from Raleigh and they drove across North River Marsh, and all he could talk about is how much water there is. We've already gotten numb to it because the North River Marsh is always so full, but it was the northeast wind and all that. So tide is a much less threatening word than climate change. Climate change has its political ramifications. I don't think anybody at the ground level, I think everybody gives it as a foregone conclusion that, you know, the globe is warming up and the problem is so great, we can't solve it. What we've got to do is figure out how to live with it. And so that's where the local people are, is how do I get through another storm season? How do I get through another winter with northeast winds? The crowd to Hazardous, you know, they're always stocked up and ready for Highway 12 to go out for a week. I mean, that's not even an uncertainty. Now that's the certainty. It's just a matter of when and how many days. So the reality of it, I think, is where the conversation has changed at the local level. Used to, it was a storm, you got cleaned up, it'd be 5 or 6 years before another one came. And, you know, after Florence, exactly a year later, here comes Dorian. And in the beginning, it was headed right toward us. And it was a very strong undercurrent of PTSD. Because the other thing we haven't touched on is the whole mental health issues around this cumulative impact. You know, how many times can you get flooded and still pick your head up and go again? So it's the cumulative impacts and the mental health and the age and the marginalized communities and just the sense of place, the people who've lived here forever. That's a real factor. And it may seem foolish to somebody in a building with no windows to say, well, you've been flooded 17 times. Well, if it's yours, it's different. And so my question is, how can we adapt? How can we prepare? How can we accept the fact that we're going to get flooded? And how do we get out of the way, let the tide come, let the tide fall, and do it like the old crowd did. They had a plug in the floor, and the tide came in, they pulled the plug, and the tide went out, put the plug back in, and washed the mud out with it. So a lot of that's happening at Ocracoke now in these old houses. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, I'd like to just speak for a second on that, the mental health issue, because I think that doesn't get enough attention. I was in New Bern covering basically the year after Florence, doing a story just of that community, which was hit very hard in Florence. And as Dorian was bearing down on the coast, and that's all, that was just on everybody's mind. Everyone was worried about that next storm. And I think that's what Florence did to everyone. Even up in Raleigh with policymakers or just folks that I talked to on the coast. It was, you ask them what changed your mind, and they all said it was that second storm. And really it was, the stories you heard from people. I was up in the Triangle interviewing people during Florence, interviewing people in shelters, and there were a lot of folks from the New Bern area. That's why I wanted to go back down there, Trenton and Jones County, areas that got hit by Floyd, areas that got hit by Matthew, areas that got hit, were getting hit again, and the idea that you would go to somebody in that situation within a couple of weeks of that the government would go to somebody in that situation a couple of weeks after that event and try to buy their home from them. The people with that much stress and that much just psychological pressure and hurt. But that's how the system works right now. The buyouts kind of come right after the event. The buyouts need to be happening now. They need to be happening in a saner way, in a more methodical way. I think what the state is grappling with from a lot of different angles, policy angle, psychological angle, is how do we go from a storm to storm kind of response where, oh, we got hit by a big storm, and so now we formed the Floyd committee and we saved everybody we can, and then the Florence committee. No, it's not storm to storm. We know another storm is coming. We know that there will be a bad storm, and I think that's what we're trying to figure out, how to kind of get to, how do you plan, how do you make people whole in that kind of environment? Because as Kathie will tell you, there's the new normal, and then there's the next new normal, and then there's the next new normal. And we don't get to where the new normals stop for who knows when, so, how do we plan for that? How do we prepare for that? How do we become resilient to that?
And Mark, we just have a few minutes left today together, but in terms of this project was looking at how minds have changed. What is Coastal Review Online looking at next in terms of the next parts of this conversation, the next work that you all are going to do around issues of climate science?
Well, our plan is to take a more forward-looking approach and examine the steps that it's going to require to get where we need to be, the path forward. So we're gonna look at the state resilience plan and try to pick it apart and bring it to the street. Bring it to the level of people living here on the coast, and what needs to happen. Is it building codes? Is it building height restrictions? It's restricting development where there has been flooding. Looking at housing, affordable housing, because I hate to keep going back, but the folks who can afford it the least are the ones who are bearing the worst of these storms and the worst of the flooding. They're in the low-lying areas. So what's it going to take to address these situations?
Thank you, Mark. I am so thankful to Mark Hibbs, Kirk Ross, Kathie Dello, Karen Willis Amspacher, and Yolanda House for today's conversation. And thank you to our audience. Thank you also to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for today's session. I'd also like to give a big thank you to our donors, including the One Earth Fund and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education. We appreciate all of you for joining us today. And for those of you who are able, please support our mission with any level of contribution. Remember, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism education organization, and so we depend on donors to carry on our work. This Thursday, we'll turn to session 2 of the Coastal Southeast. Thursday's conversation will feature the Post and Courier reporter, Tony Bartlemay, Georgia Public Broadcasting reporter Emily Jones, and the state reporter Sammy Fretwell. Thursday's conversation will address the threat of hurricanes and sea level rise to septic systems in Georgia, bacteria found in Charleston's floodwaters, and the impact of climate change on communities in the Carolinas just beyond the beach. Please register for Thursday's session at pulitzercenter.org. And of course, feel free to share this event information widely with your friends and colleagues. Please stay with us for a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. Thank you for being with us today, and we'll hope you join us again soon. Bye for now.